everyone to Thirsty Thursday, and it's Bourbon Heritage Month. So we're celebrating all things bourbon tonight and at our stores. And we have Adam Harris here, who is a bourbon expert and is going to talk us through 4 great brands that we love to drink, whether it's on their own or mixed in a cocktail. So we're going to just go ahead and get started. He has a great drink he came up with tonight for us, and then we're going to get into tasting the different bourbons and learn all we can from you. So thank you, Adam, for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you for having me, and thanks to Mariano's family for having me as well. My name is Adam Harris, the Senior Ambassador for the James B. Beam Distilling Company, and that's just a fancy way of saying that I get to talk about bourbon all day, which is one of my favorite things to do. I like having a little sip here and there and drinking bourbon, but I like talking about bourbon and sharing stories about bourbon even more. And I am very happy to be here tonight because we are in the middle of Bourbon Heritage Month, and it's something that we have been celebrating as a country for, about the last 13 years or so. And it's really based in the fact that we celebrate Bourbon Fest in Kentucky, in Bardstown, Kentucky, the 3rd Saturday in September every year. And we've been doing that for well over 2 decades now. But for the longest time, we only kept it a very small event. And we decided that we would get together and get the government to agree and declare September to be Bourbon Heritage Month, which allows us to speak a little bit more about bourbon and speak a little bit louder about bourbon and let people know that this is our native spirit and it's worth celebrating. You know, in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson was our president. And even though we've been making bourbon for well over 2 centuries at this point, he had seen that, the UN recognized tequila as the official spirit of Mexico and recognized cognac as the official spirit of France. And he said, well, what the heck are we doing? We need our own spirit. And he was a bourbon drinker, and LBJ, the B stands for bourbon, right? Lyndon Bourbon Johnson. And so he said that we needed our own spirit. As a bourbon drinker, he knew that historically a lot of influential Americans, whether they be political leaders, cultural leaders, whatnot, artists, they were bourbon drinkers too. And so he decided that we would declare bourbon to be our native spirit. And so for the first time ever, now that we declared something as our own and uniquely ours, we had to define what it was. And so very simply, bourbon is an American-made product. You can only make it here in the U.S. We'll talk about why Kentucky is so important for making good bourbon. You have to be aged in a new and used charred oak barrel. We like to use American white oak, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You have to be at least 51% corn to be a bourbon and a mash bill. The mash bill is just a different percentage of grains that you use to create a bourbon. And tonight we'll talk about 3 distinct mash bills. Then you can't distill your bourbon any higher than 160 proof. Can't put your bourbon into a barrel any higher than 125 proof. You can't go into a bottle any lower than 80 proof. We'll try 2 very nice 80 proof bourbons tonight. And then last but not least, bourbon is a very authentic whiskey, meaning that you cannot add or subtract any flavors or colors to your distillate, which is the whiskey that comes off the still, before you put it into your barrel for maturation. The only thing we can add is water, because that's not a flavor nor a color as far as we and the government are concerned. If you like flavored bourbon, if you like flavored whiskey, flavored bourbon, flavored rye, we're allowed to add a little bit of flavor to the bourbon after it's been matured. So as long as you don't add anything to it prior to maturation, and you add those flavors like, say, a Jim Beam vanilla or Jim Beam peach, that's fair game as long as that happens after maturation. So if you're playing by those rules, you are making bourbon, and if you're enjoying the way that we make bourbon, then you're celebrating Bourbon and Heritage Month with us tonight. And we are going to go through 4 fantastic bourbons from the Beam Suntory portfolio, representing 2 amazing distilleries, both in Kentucky. Of course, we have the James B. Beam Distillery, which we're going to try 3 out of the 4 bourbons tonight. And then we have our sister distillery down the road, a beautiful boutique bourbon distillery, Maker's Mark, that's been making their handmade whiskey, bourbon whiskey for a very long time as well. So what I wanted to do is get everybody comfortable and start off with a cocktail so we can have something to sip on while we're talking and asking questions and learning. And so the drink that I'd like to make for y'all tonight, and I'd encourage you, if you have these ingredients, to follow along at home, or if you just have your favorite drink ingredients around, go ahead and hop behind your bar and start mixing with me. But I'm going to make what's I consider to be a modern classic. It's called the Black Manhattan. And I mean it's a modern classic because it's been around for the better part of the last 2 decades. It was created out in San Francisco at a wonderful whiskey bar called Bourbon and Branch. And call it modern, a classic, because most people know it. Most bartenders will know how to make it, Black Manhattan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a little bit of Knob Creek as my bourbon of choice. because it's got a big, bold flavor that we'll discuss. And then I'm going to use a Verna. But I know my friend, Mr. Matt Janata, has talked to you guys quite a few times, and he's instructed y'all on how to make a cocktail. And so I'm going to go exactly in agreement with his methodology, which is start with your cheaper ingredients first. And so I have my mixing glass here because I'm going to make a stirred drink, a very brown and boozy stirred drink. Again, this is a take on a Manhattan, as you might imagine. So I'll start with my bitters, orange and Angostura. We're going to do 1 dash of each. And as you know, you don't want to kind of just very bashfully put your bitters in there. When it says a dash, you want to give it a real dash, right? And so 1 dash of Angostura, 1 dash of Angostura orange, or if you have any other orange bitters, please feel free to use those. I like Regan's bitters as well. And again, you can get all of these ingredients at Mariano's. I'm going to go ahead at this point and add some ice to start cooling down the glass. Trust me, I've been washing my hands as everybody else has. I'm going to put in 1 part, and this will be an ounce of Averna. It's a very good Amaro, which is very bitter with a little bit of sweetness, dark, rich flavors. And then I'm going to put 2 parts my Knob Creek small batch bourbon in. For those of y'all that are Jigger loyalists, excuse me, please forgive me, I forgot my Jigger at home. I'm borrowing someone's nicer kitchen tonight, just so you know, that's what that means. Let's go ahead and we're going to stir this drink. I'm going to take out my cocktail glass, which is a Nick and Nora, which is just a little bit of a different cocktail, a coupe style glass. And as you probably know by now, you're going to stir this drink to achieve about 25% dilution, 25%, and certainly chill that spirit-forward beverage down to where it's going to be a much more enjoyable cocktail and sipper. Take my julep strainer, pour out that delicious Black Manhattan. And look at that, he's still got it, folks. And now I'm going to use a Luxardo cherry, not one of those radioactive cherries. Those are great for Shirley Temples and your kids, but if we're making cocktails, we want to use our Luxardo cherry. And I'm going to go ahead and just pop that in the drink so I can enjoy a little sip of this Black Manhattan. Cheers to you and your cocktail.
I see Matt Janata. Cheers.
There you go. Cheers to y'all. That is a great drink. I highly recommend, if you've never made one of these before, if you've never had one or asked for one at a bar, please do. I think you'll really enjoy it. Simple twist on a classic. And again, most bartenders from a cocktail set will know how to make this drink, and it really is a great way. I understand the weather is getting nice in Chicago, and you're starting to get a little bit of that kiss of fall on the wind. And this little drink here is a great one to have while you're out there enjoying cocktails for the weather.
It is very fall-like here right now in Chicago, I think. It's very crisp, and, you know, we need jackets, and Matt has his, like, vest on, so.
Awesome.
Yep.
So, yeah, a lot of people start picking up whiskey around this time of year, you know, as the air starts to crisp up and the leaves start to change. There are those folks out there, and I don't understand them because I don't drink like this, but they put down bourbon when they have their last mint julep in May and on Derby Day, and then they don't pick it up again until they put their wool socks on. I drink bourbon all year round. You know, there's plenty of different bourbon cocktails and different bourbons with unique flavor profiles that fit any season. And so hopefully tonight, as we go through some of the whiskeys that we're going to try, you guys will find some that you think will be appropriate for not just that traditional whiskey weather, but for that weather all year long. So let's see here. Where do we want to start? I want to make sure that you guys feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. Send them through the chat. They'll be happy to moderate, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about the specifics of those regulations, those standards of identity that make bourbon bourbon. You know, we have been, and how we got there, I guess. So when you think about the history of American whiskey, a lot of you will probably already know that rye was the first whiskey that was made in the United States. And that really happened as immigrants headed over from European, Bavarian descent, more or less, and started settling into the Northeast. A lot of them knew a couple of things: raising families, working a farm, and distilling whiskey. And so they kept those practices over in the new country as they settled in young America at the time. And the grain that grew plentifully, as opposed to barley over in the motherland for them, what grew easily in the Northeast was rye. And so whiskey distillation wasn't necessarily a goal for a lot of folks. A lot of folks, what they did was they farmed, and when they had an excess of grain, instead of letting that grain store too long and spoil, what they could do is if they had a friend that had a mill, they could give him some grain and also have them mill some of the grain for them. And then if they had a friend with a still, then they could take some of that milled grain and give it to their friend with a still who could make some bread for his family, and then also start to ferment some of that grain and create a beer that would then run through their still. So it became this little bit of a commodity within the small communities that were starting to pepper the settlement of the new country. And so it wasn't really until later that people became actual distillers. Even our founder, Jacob Bean, who started our company, or not our company, but started making whiskey under the Bean name in 1795, he didn't start off with this grand vision of being a distiller. The whiskey that he made as he moved into modern day Kentucky, he actually started off in the Northeast, moved to Maryland, and then he moved to modern day Kentucky, which was at the time the Virginia Commonwealth, after the Revolutionary War. And the Revolutionary War had incentivized a few folks through the corn writ to move into the area if they promised to do a couple of things. Either you could have served in the military and you would get a plot of land, or you could promise to grow a certain acreage of corn and you would get a plot of land. And Jacob Bean, who was in Maryland at the time, he moved over into that Virginia Commonwealth with the idea of farming, and then he began distilling too. But he wasn't really distilling at a distillery, he distilled small scale. And the whiskey that he was making wasn't even aged at the time. It's called Old Jake Bean. And so this was very common amongst people that were farmer distillers or gentleman distillers at the time. Now that rye grain that had grown so plentifully in the Northeast did not grow so plentifully in the breadbasket of the Southern Midwest, where Kentucky now lies. But we did begin to grow a lot of corn. And even though that corn isn't a native grain, it's native to South America, it does proliferate very easy here in the US, as we know. And so corn became this huge king of a grain in a very fast time. And so there became a lot of bourbon distillers in modern day Kentucky. And modern day Kentucky then, because of the environment that we have, really became the birthplace and is still the homeland of bourbon. And even though you can make bourbon anywhere in the United States, as we learned, as it is an American product, and they do make bourbon in Chicago and in Illinois and some of the surrounding areas that some people might be tuning in from, bourbon's about 95% of our bourbon as a country does still come from Kentucky. And it's for several reasons. You know, first, of course, we have the know-how. We've been doing it there longer than anybody else has, obviously. We have generational families like the Bean family and the Samuels family that have been doing it and have that genealogical know-how that just runs through their veins. And then you have weather and access to resources that you desperately need to create good bourbon. And so being there, knowing that we have to be at least 51% corn, being in the breadbasket of the Midwest there, with that access, with that corn growing so plentifully and easily in Kentucky, in Indiana, that's where we get a lot of our grains from. And then when we think about the wood that we have to use, I mentioned that we have to use a brand new unused charred oak container, charred oak barrel. We like to use American white oak. And American white oak grows plentifully in the forest area of Arkansas and Missouri. And so that's where, through Independent Stave, the people that make our barrels for both of our distilleries, they will harvest that oak responsibly, about 75 to 80-year-old oak trees, and then replant at least 2 in their stead when they cut them down and create these barrels for us that we use. So it's that access to resource that's so important. And then our environment as well. You know, we speak to limestone filtered water. That's very important for us in Kentucky. It's we sit right over a limestone bed that can run about 500 to 7 feet thick. Almost the entire state sits on this limestone shelf, a little bit of northern Tennessee too. And so that water, as rain comes down, it will leach through this limestone before it hits the aquifer. And as it leaches through the limestone removes iron from the rainwater. And iron is a bad mineral ingredient for whiskey. Creates bad black looking whiskey. Not a good color for whiskey. We like our golden amber color that we get. So that instead, it does take out that limestone, but it replaces it with calcium and magnesium. And that's a really great ingredient for yeast to begin the fermentation process. And we won't get into that too nerdy. I'll be happy to answer any nerdy questions if you like, but we'll try to keep it on a certain level. We'll definitely keep this 101. We could do 201 in the Q&A later, but we'll keep it more or less 101. But it's that calcium-enriched water that actually helps the grass grow too, and it gives it that blue tint. And funny enough, when the horses in Kentucky eat that limestone or that calcium-rich grass, it makes their bones very strong. So when a racehorse has to use all those muscles to run as fast as they do in all the races and the derbies, they need to have strong bones to hold up to that muscular strain that's going on. So I like to say that, you know, that limestone filtered water in Kentucky makes the bourbon good, the horses fast, and the women pretty. And I guess the men handsome too, so it's not a bad thing. But it's a great thing having that limestone filtered water. But the other thing about our environment that is so important to me that we probably don't talk about enough is our climate. And so if you've been down to Kentucky, it's a stone's throw from Chicago. You know, we have a Midwestern winter. We just don't have that lake effect that you guys have. Being where we are, we also have a very southern summer. So it's very warm and it's very cold. And then it also has a beautiful fall and a beautiful spring. And so that fall and spring are really going to help bring together what we need in order to age our whiskey the right way. And that climate is very important for aging, because when that bourbon goes into that brand new barrel that's been charred, by charring the barrel, what we've done is we've caramelized all the wood sugars, right? So those wood sugars are going to give us the flavors of vanilla and caramel, and through maturation, some of the fruity notes that we like, and the coconut notes and the butterscotch notes that we get in good bourbon. It's going to come from that barrel. So when the whiskey goes into that barrel, if it's a corn-based whiskey like bourbon should be, it has to be, it's going to have a very nutty, corny bite. If you drink our White Dog, which is the unaged whiskey, from either distillery, you'll get a great green corn note, almost like you're standing in the middle of a cornfield before harvest. It's a great feeling, but it's a great taste, but it's very punchy. What we need to do is we need to blend that flavor with the barrel oak influence in order to balance the flavor. So once that whiskey goes into that bourbon barrel, it's going to start to breathe. And it breathes through the season. So when it's hot outside, imagine you're in Chicago and let's say May, you have that first really beautiful late spring, early summer day in May, and you walk outside and you don't have to wear a jacket, and you don't have, and the sky is crystal clear and blue, and the sun is high and it's beautiful, and naturally you react how? You breathe it in, right? You kind of have a little sun salutation in a way. And so the barrel does the exact same thing. When it's hot outside, the barrel's going to take a breath in, and it's going to pull that whiskey through that layer of char into the red line, where it's going to start to get all of its color, because we get 100% of our color from that barrel interaction, and we get a good balance of our flavor from the same process. And so the whiskey goes into the barrel. Now this has 53 gallons of whiskey when it starts. And then as it breathes in, it pulls it in there, holds the whiskey in. And then when it's cold outside or cool during the season, it's going to contract and exhale, pushing that whiskey out back into the majority volume of liquid. And then it's just going to continue to breathe throughout those throughout the warm and cool parts of a day or the warm and cool parts of a season. And then as it extremes, it takes bigger breaths and exhales deeper breaths. And so that's what's going to be happening over time. And so we start to pick up coloration, and we start to get really pretty with that dark amber note and that wonderful color that we love to look at when we eye a glass of whiskey during the tasting process. And so those seasons are very, very important for us. When we go as far as distillation, we can't distill our whiskey any higher than 160 proof. If you're a whiskey fanatic and you're an equal drinker of all whiskeys, and you like Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, etc., globally, those whiskeys are allowed to distill to 190 proof. But we don't go any higher than 160 because we already have something that comes off the still colorless. But if we distill any higher than 160, it's a pretty common practice for us to believe that, you know, you start to really create something that has no odor or flavor. And we want to keep all those big, bold flavors that bourbons are known for. So if we go to something above 160 and start to create something that's not just colorless, but odorless and flavorless, up until recently, that was the definition of vodka. And I don't really wake up in the morning to talk about vodka, if I'm being completely honest. So nothing wrong with it, but you know, I like my bourbons and my ryes. So anyhow, we don't distill above 160 to keep those flavors. And anything that we're going to talk about today, we don't distill above 135, 130, 120, or 130 and one about 17. So we'll talk about how that affects the flavor as we taste these bourbons too. And then when we talk about barrel entry strength, and we talk about you can't go any higher than 125, we just mentioned that if we distilled to 130, 135, then we would have to add a little bit of water, not a flavor or a color, as that last rule dictates. So now we have a little bit of water added to bring it down to that maximum barrel strength. Reason being, if you had something that was very high proof, 140 to 160, or even if across the pond you're doing 190, that alcohol is going to be a solvent, so it'll chew through the barrel. We want the whiskey to love the barrel, and we want the barrel to love the whiskey back. So we want to gradually have it integrate and work its way through the barrel wood, picking up the wood sugars that have been caramelized and all those wonderful flavors that are going to contribute to the balance of a beautiful bourbon. So there's that. And then if we go above 125, or if you're a fan of bourbons and you like things like Booker's cast strength whiskey, we put that whiskey right in there at 125, and we let nature do its thing. And if it comes out hotter, which it tends to be, or a higher proof, I didn't mean to say hotter, but say higher. If it comes out higher, say about 128, 130, then we give you every bit of that whiskey. We don't add any water to it. It's cast strength, or barrel strength, or original proof, however you want to say it. I enjoy some of those whiskeys, but as Fred, our seventh generation master distiller, who's the son of Booker Noe, who started small batch bourbon, says, if he's drinking Booker's at that cast strength, he better be in his pajamas or headed to his pajamas. So he calls that pajama whiskey. So I might, y'all might want to carry that little advice with you too. Let's see here. And then last but not least,
Adam,
yes,
we have a few
please.
questions. Now a good time.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so Tony would like to know, is it true that barrels are set at different heights? And if so, why?
Yes, they are. So these two distilleries are going to demonstrate two different ways of aging whiskey. We have rick houses or rack houses. There are whiskey warehouses. And every floor of our whiskey warehouse has a rack on it. And that rack will stack 3 barrels high. And so if we have a 7-story warehouse, then you've got 21 racks of barrels between 7 floors. We also have made 9-story warehouses in the past. We can no longer make 9-story warehouses because this is a very charming little fact about the great state of Kentucky. We can't build our warehouses any higher than 7 stories anymore because the ladders on fire trucks don't go up higher than 7 stories. So in case there's some sort of disaster, hopefully not, we never want to have those hanging around or any of those happening to any of us. We only have the 7 stories, so we can help whatever, we can give help to wherever we need to if we do have a bad situation on our hands. So yes, every barrel is stacked, but they're not stacked on each other. There are some distilleries across the pond. I think Irish whiskey will stack the barrels on top of each other in different formations and whatnot. But we put them on these on a dunnage or a rick, which is just it's a track. So either it's on the bottom or the track that's on the second tier, which is going to be about belly chest high, and then right at head level there's going to be that third rack on that third track, and that's how we stack them. And you'll get about 25 racks going down one side, and as you come down the other side of the warehouse on the hallway in the middle, you'll come back down 25 more on a bigger warehouse. Our warehouses can hold, some of the older ones will hold just over 20,000 barrels or just over 19,000 barrels. And then our bigger ones, and we're only building bigger ones, the bigger ones will hold over 50,000 barrels of whiskey. So there's a heck of a lot of whiskey there. When you think about the amount of whiskey barrels maturing in the state of Kentucky right now, there is over 5 million. The last census for the state had about 3.5 million men, women, and children. There's probably a couple thousand racehorses living there in Kentucky. So we have enough whiskey in the state of Kentucky for every man, woman, child, and horse to have a barrel to themselves. Not that I'm promoting animals drink, but also between our two distilleries, Maker's Mark and the James B. Beam Distilling Company, we've got over half of that inventory aging with our names on it one way or another. So when people talk about whiskey shortages, it's not really such a thing over here between Maker's Mark and Jim B. So hopefully that answers your question, Tony.
Yes, she says
Perfect.
yes. Then I have like how do barrels get charred?
Yeah, so it's a pretty simple process. The folks at Independent Stave, what they'll do is they'll put together a barrel made out of about 32 to 33 staves. They put on the hoops, and then they'll put, they won't put the heads or tails, the head or butt on the barrel yet. What they'll do is they'll then char the barrel with a natural gas flame, and it's an incredibly intense heat. And so the charring process, as the barrel rolls past the flame, it only lasts a matter of moments. It's not even minutes, it's just moments. The char, the heat is so intense coming off that big flame. It's like a flamethrower, really. So as that barrel rolls past the flamethrower, it sits there for those several moments, and then it'll roll on, and the next one will happen. And that's just a really great smell in that room. It's steamy, it's sweaty, and it just smells like charred wood, and it's really great. But when that flame hits the inside of that barrel, the wood sugars will concentrate towards the surface of that compromised area to protect itself, and that's where they begin to caramelize. The layer of char that's inside a barrel, if you've seen a barrel before, that's actually an inert filter. That's just carbon. It doesn't taste like anything. It helps filter out some of the last impurities that we may not have been able to get through distillation, which is mostly sulfurous compounds. Not a bad thing for mouthfeel, but if you get too much to start flavoring things, you have an idea of what sulfur might smell and taste like, right? Rotten eggs or toots or something like that. So you don't want that in your whiskey. Yeah? So where really all the flavor and color comes from the barrel's perspective, is from what's underneath that layer of char, which is what we call the red line. And it literally is a red line. And it's just the caramelized sugar that lays right underneath that layer of char. And so as the barrel breathes, pulling the whiskey through the char and into the red line, that's where we're going to get all that color and a good balance of our flavor from. So the charring process is pretty simple. There's some other folks that are more boutique or smaller that might harken back to an old style of charring barrels, which is just sort of making it and maybe setting a fire with some hay in it or something like that and letting it burn for a long time. That's a little bit, that's probably a little more guesswork involved in that. But the folks at Independent Stave that have been doing this for 4 generations or so, they got it down to a pretty good science. And they make barrels for not just us, for pretty much everybody that puts whiskey or wine into a barrel in the United States and the globe.
Very cool. Thanks, Adam.
Great questions, guys. Please keep them coming.
Yeah, I think we're good for now. But Carolyn is, she's been on both sides of the trail, and she loves it and wants everyone to know that if anyone has any questions about the trail, I know we can come to all of us, but she seems like she's like really been there a lot, Carolyn. So that's awesome.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly have 2 favorite distilleries, but once you get down to Kentucky, you got to see them all because they're all unique. You know, we all play by the same rules. Those standards of identity that I mentioned, we're all doing our version of that. We sing the same gospel, we just sing it in different keys. And so going to see, you know, Heaven Hill or Wild Turkey, Buffalo Trace, Woodford Reserve, Four Roses, all the big guys, and then some of the smaller guys too. Peerless, Limestone Branch, those guys are doing great jobs, and all their distilleries are very unique and very different. You'll see a lot of similarities, obviously, in the production process, but you'll also see what makes us different, what makes us unique, and it's a great thing. It's a great thing. I love Bourbon Heritage Month because we are true. You know, bourbon is really a family sort of affair, especially when you're in Kentucky, and then to celebrate together is really what it's all about. To celebrate bourbon, not to just celebrate Jim Beam or Small Batch or Maker's Mark, but to celebrate bourbon in general, and then get the chance to highlight some of my favorites is really what it's all about. So I'm glad you've been to the Bourbon Trail and maybe even the Urban Bourbon Trail. I think there's actually something set up in Chicago right now that is a bit of a Chicago Bourbon Trail, which is featuring cocktails.
We need to know about that. Tony and I are on it if there is one, right, Tony?
Yeah, I want to say that that's actually a thing, and I can check with my more Chicago-centric contacts, but I'll see if I'll confirm that with you.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I mean, I know, you know, there's a lot of local companies that make bourbon and whiskey, but yeah, that would be cool. Let us know. That sounds fun.
Yeah, absolutely will. Absolutely will. So what do you guys say we taste a little whiskey?
Sure.
Yeah.
Rip in.
All right. So let's go ahead and we're going to start with the #1 bourbon in the world, and no better place to start than with Jim Beam White Label. This is a 4-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. It has been made, this is based on that recipe that I kind of harken back to with Jacob Beam started in 1795. Our recipe is based on what he started with. It's not the exact same, but it does pay an homage to the roots with our percentage of corn, rye, and barley. We don't disclose our mash bills in Claremont, where our distillery is. At Maker's Mark, I'll tell you a little bit more about the mash bill there. But we won't talk about any of our mash bills here. This is a traditional bourbon mash bill of corn, rye, and barley. We're going to get that sweet, nutty flavors from the corn. We're going to get some of the spice from the rye, and we're going to get some of the beer and biscuity mouthfeel notes from that barley that are in there. Jim Beam was our 4th generation master distiller. We have 7 generations of master distillers going back to 1795. No other distillery, no other whiskey making family in the United States can tout those sort of credentials. That sort of history, it's just not done. You know, the 4th generation, James Beauregard Beam, he took over just in time for Prohibition to hit. You know, shortly after his reign started, Prohibition began, and in Kentucky, we had to suffer through 15 years of Prohibition as opposed to the 13 years that the rest of the country enjoyed. I say that loosely, enjoyed. So when they reopened, it was called the Old Tub Distillery. And the Old Tub was the brand that the family began in the first 3 generations that actually started to make a little bit of money. It was the 3rd generation of our family. It was Jacob Bean's grandson, David M. Bean, that really started to take the family business into, or take the family whiskey into a business proposition. He was an entrepreneur. And so he started to make the family whiskey. And then when he passed it on to his son, or one of his sons, Colonel James B. Bean, he was making Old Tub. He was making the family whiskey as well as whiskeys called like Pebble Ford and Crystal Springs and those sort of things. Now, when Prohibition ended, the distillery that he bought in Claremont, Kentucky, right before Prohibition began, he had to rebuild it. And with his little group of his family, about 20 so people, and the age of 72 years old himself, Colonel James B. Bean rebuilt the distillery in just over 120 days. And so when that happened, as he began to retire, he started to make Jim Beam bourbon and renamed the distillery the Jim Beam Distillery. And so that bourbon really kind of set the benchmark for everything we did at that point. So we have a very rich history to go back to 1795, but I like to consider Jim Beam being the one that sets our foundation for the business as you guys know it now, and the bourbons as you guys know it now. Jim Beam actually captured the yeast strain that we use to ferment the beer that we're going to create before we actually distill it into the whiskey and the white dog that we then will age. And then this bourbon here is going to be 4 years old at 80 proof. So that's, again, as low as you can go inside the barrel. Jim Beam's son, Jeremiah Beam, is really who we consider to be our first global ambassador. He took the family bourbon, now Jim Beam White Label, and he traveled around the country and the world with it. He's the one that really set the groundwork for us to become that global icon of the #1 bourbon out there. So that's the Jim Beam White Label, 4 years old at 80 proof. Whenever you see an age statement on a bottle, you'll know that the youngest barrel blended into that blend or that batch is the age that is stated on the bottle. We don't have our age stated on the Jim Beam, but we do say Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. All I need to know is from what I can read on this label. So Jim Beam, Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. All right, what do I know from this? I know where it comes from, Jim Beam, right, the brand. I know what state it's made in, Kentucky. I know what bourbon means because I know exactly what we talked about for our standards of identity. You got that nice Cubs bottle there, very good. And then whiskey, I know it's a grain-based distillate that spends some time aging. Now that word straight is going to be unique. A lot of folks don't know what the word straight on a label means. That means that it has been aged for at least 2 years inside the American oak barrel. So you can put the word straight on your label if your whiskey is aged for 2 years. Up to 4 years, or 3 years and 364 days, you have to put how old your whiskey is on your label. So if I made a 3-year-old whiskey, I could say Adams Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey aged 3 years. I would have to put that on there. After you've aged your whiskey in that barrel for 4 years, it's your prerogative to put that age statement, that number, that year number on your barrel, or on your bottle, excuse me. So if I see something that says Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey but doesn't show an age statement on there, I can assume that the youngest barrel in the batch is going to be 4 years old, right? And so we are 4 years old and then some with some of the whiskeys that we will blend together, some of the bourbon barrels that we will blend together to create our batch of Jim Beam White. So the whiskey here, we're going to see the color of it. It's got a nice, I would say, honeyed color, kind of dark straw color there, golden for sure. When you taste whiskey, I'm not going to teach any of you how to drink whiskey. You already know how to drink. But maybe I can teach you a little better way to taste. I do about a 4-step process. And you always want to look for the color. The darker the whiskey, or the lighter the whiskey, are going to be an indicator of one of two things, or both. That's going to be the amount of time that it's been inside the oak barrel, so the interaction with the oak absorbing more color and flavor, and then also how much water has or hasn't been added. So the darker the whiskey, the higher the proof, the longer it's been in the barrel, the lighter the whiskey, the more water's been added, the lower proof, or the less time it's spent in the barrel. Now we have a nice golden honey color. When I nose the whiskey, especially as we start to climb the mountain to higher proofs, you never want to throw your nose in the glass. One, you might risk drinking through your nose. Two, you're going to definitely risk snorting ethanol alcohol vapor right up into your snooter, and it's going to anesthetize the taste buds, your olfactory bulb that lives right here that helps you drive taste bud flavor reception. So you don't want to anesthetize that thing. You want to be able to smell and taste everything. And you know, it's almost dinner time, so you want to be able to taste your dinner, and I've brought you some good bourbon today, so I want you to be able to taste a good bourbon. So the best way to avoid sniffing up a bunch of alcohol, I don't like the smell of alcohol, I like the smell of bourbon, right? And I think you probably agree. The best way to do that is to set your nose over the glass, whatever type of glass you're using, part your lips, and breathe in through your nose. And by doing that, you actually smell the sweet vanilla notes, the caramel notes. With the bean, you're going to pick up a little bit of grain aroma, some of that corny aroma. And you're going to get a little bit of that oaky aroma too, right? So getting those aromas are going to help you understand what sort of flavors to expect. I always like to say, we'll see if the flavor delivers what the aroma promises. And so the best way to taste whiskey, in my opinion, is something that Booker did called the Kentucky Chew. And he enjoyed tasting his whiskey this way, and he taught it to Fred, and Fred teaches it to us. Fred is Booker's son again, our 7th generation distiller. And it looks a little funny, and it sounds a little silly, but I think it's a great way to taste bourbon. And so I'm going to show you all how to do the Kentucky Chew. What you want to do is set the whiskey on the middle of your tongue as you take the drink, and then hold it for a beat or two, and then really literally begin to chew on your whiskey. After you swallow it, what you want to do is smack your lips. And after we do that, pay attention to the flavor and the finish. And I'll tell you why I think the Kentucky Chew is not just a silly little way of tasting whiskey, but actually has a lot of scientific benefit to really experiencing flavor and finish. So watch me do the Kentucky Chew, and then we'll go ahead and do it together. So here we go. Here's a little Jim Beam White.
I can actually hear you.
All right. So
We can actually hear you chewing. I can hear you chewing. That was really cool.
I've chewed many a whiskey. I've gotten pretty good at being loud with it. So chewing on your whiskey is going to coat your palate. So really get in there, really chew on it. Get it over your tongue, get it on your hard palate, get it under your tongue, get it on your gums. It's going to coat your palate, and that's what's going to drive your flavor reception. You're going to get that corn note. You're going to get those vanillins. You're going to get a little citrus. When you smack your lips, you're bringing air across your tongue. That's going to activate your taste buds by that aeration. And so your taste buds are going to stand up, and that's going to help you appreciate the finish. So is this a quick and clean or a medium bodied finish? Is this a full and mouth-watering finish? You know, there's a little bit of, with Jim Beam, I think it's about a medium finish. It's got a nice clean flavor to it. It's not too long and lingering. For me, it's finishing up about now, which is probably about a 40-second finish or so. So I think it's going to last for quite some time. And as we move around from these bourbons, you'll get to see different flavor profiles that leave different flavors and finishes on your tongue and in your mouth. So that's Jim Beam. That is the #1 bourbon in the world. That uses our traditional bourbon mash bill, uses our traditional yeast that was captured by the Colonel James B. Beam on his windowsill in his kitchen in Bardstown, Kentucky. He actually captured the yeast, propagated it himself. Any questions about Jim Beam White Label?
We have one question from Tony. Is how is this one different from the Black Label Extra Aged?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tony, again. So Jim Beam White and Jim Beam Black are very similar in a lot of their DNA. Of course, they share the same mash bill. They share the same water. They share the same yeast. We even distill them to the same proof. Big difference is going to be in aging. So we're going to blend fewer barrels to make a batch of Jim Beam Black than we do Jim Beam White. Jim Beam Black is not a small batch for us, but we do blend fewer barrels in that batch. Also, Jim Beam Black is going to be bottled at 86 proof as opposed to 80 proof, so you get a little more bang for your buck on that one. And then also we have anywhere between about 2, 3, 4 years more in the barrel in that blend for the batch than we do on Jim Beam White. So you're looking at, instead of starting at 4 years old, we're going to start about 6 years old and look for some older barrels to make a good flavor of Jim Beam Black. That's really going to have a bit more of a more mature whiskey flavor, a more mature bourbon flavor with some of those vanillins and caramels really starting to take lead in the flavor profile instead of sort of leading with some of that grain note that you're picking up from the Jim Beam White. And I hope a lot of y'all are picking up on that. Some people say that they get the flavor of kind of circus peanut candy. Some people kind of get caramel corn, so maybe you picked up on some of those notes as you were tasting Jim Beam. I'm not the kind of person that's going to sit there and tell you what to smell or taste, because if I tell you that you're smelling sweet potatoes and tasting roasted marshmallows, you're going to say absolutely. And in the same vote, I could probably tell you that I smelled Spanish saddle leather and tasted Mississippi mud. And, if you thought that I knew what I was talking about, you'd say absolutely, me too. So I like for y'all to, take your own tasting notes. I'll say, you can paint some very broad strokes of some of the aromas and flavors to look for with your sweet notes of vanilla and caramel, and then your oakier notes, your nutty notes and your spicy notes. The nutty notes can speak to the fruit of the nut itself, or it can speak to the shell, the husk. And then spicy notes can speak to anything from your traditional baking spices, cinnamon, clove, etc., to your black peppers or your chili peppers. So, there's a whole host of things, and it's really upon you as the person enjoying to use your sense memory and the things that you've smelled and tasted in your life, or even the physical experiences you've had in your life, to kind of start to paint your own picture and write your own words for the way that you think about that particular whiskey, right? So,
Adam, what kind of glass we have another question of what kind of glass are you using for
yes,
tasting?
this is actually a Libby sherry copita. So this is, I like this glass. Glencairns are great. I know those very fancy whiskey glasses are fantastic. And it makes everybody look very fancy when they drink them. Those are actually engineered. Anytime you see something with that tulip chimney, that glass, that Glencairn, is actually engineered to put that whiskey on the middle of your tongue. That's why I instructed you guys to put the whiskey on the middle of your tongue when you took that sip. And the Glencairn is engineered for that. There's other whiskey glasses that are engineered to help you appreciate the aroma. There's other whiskey glasses that are there for cocktails, the double old-fashioned, the old-fashioned like I see you're sporting yourself. So I like this little sherry copita because I feel like it does a good job of, I don't mind a little stemmed glass when I'm tasting something. I don't care much for the snifter, to be honest, but I do like a little stem glass here. A little white wine glass will work too. Nothing like a champagne flute because it won't do the aromas any justice. I feel like this with a nice half full, I can really get a good sense of the aroma. I've got enough surface area to pick up all the aromas, and of course the flavors are going to get me where I need to go to pick them up. So that's what I answer short questions with long answers. I'm sorry. It's just my nature. So now we're going to take a little bit of a diversion. We're going to go back to the Jim Beam Distillery shortly, but we're going to take a break and go down and see our friends at the Samuels family, who have been making Maker's Mark for over 60 years. And Maker's Mark is a beautiful distillery in Loretto, Kentucky. It is truly a boutique distillery, a very Victorian setting. The grounds themselves are a nature preserve. There's more trees in Loretto on our distillery property there than there are almost diversity. Then there's more diverse trees in Loretto than there are in pretty much the whole state of Kentucky. It's a beautiful place. The grounds have been beautifully kept for the generations that the Samuels family has owned them and taken care of them and run this brand. Maker's Mark was started by Bill Samuels Sr. and his wife Marge. They had been making whiskey for generations before, but when Prohibition shut down T.W. Samuels, which was the family whiskey, when he started remaking it after Prohibition, he didn't really like the quality of it. He had always sort of wanted to try something different. So he swore never to make the whiskey again. He sold the family name to his friends at Heaven Hill for a little seed money. And they still make something called T.W. Samuels Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Has nothing to do with what the Samuels family made. Totally different recipe, only there in name only. And so he threw away he sold the name, he burned the recipe, and he wanted to make a bourbon that didn't have the bite that his family whiskey had. He didn't want to make bourbon that was somewhat indicative of the style at the time back in the 50s, of something that had a little bit more bite to it. And so he wanted to do something different. So he talked to some friends and he wanted to kind of tinker around with the mash bill and do something a little unconventional. And that's when he decided to not use rye in his mash bill. So as we talk about traditional bourbon using corn, rye, and barley, Bill settled on using a mash bill that had corn, wheat, and barley. And that soft red winter wheat is going to give Maker's Mark a little bit of a signature sweetness that it has in its flavor profile that makes it such an appealing and wonderful bourbon. This is a wheated bourbon, and it's probably the most popular and beloved wheated bourbon out there on the market. There's a handful of other ones out there. The Maker's Mark is certainly the most popular and beloved wheated bourbon out there. You know, that was what Bill Sr. was working on all those many years as he was putting together this whiskey at his distillery in Loretto. And his wife, Marge, was in charge of putting together the look of the whiskey. And she was a collector of a few things. She collected cognac, she collected fine sterling silver and pewter pieces from England. And she was a very smart woman. She had graduated valedictorian from the University of Louisville. She was a little bit of a science, she was a scientist. She was a calligrapher, so she had many interests. And so this bottle really is an homage to a lot of the things that she enjoyed because she designed this bottle. And it was the first time, and one of the few times since, that a female had ever designed a bottle of spirits. So if you look at the bottle shape and you think about a bottle of Courvoisier sitting in my right hand, you can see that it's got the long neck and the squatty body and the sloped shoulders. And so Marge, being a collector of cognac, liked that shape of a bottle, decided to square it off on both sides and ends. And then you have that unique Maker's Mark bottle shape. She also enjoyed, she liked the color red, and she used her science background to create a polymer of wax and rubber, add a little red to the mix, and hand dip the bottles. And that tradition began that day because we still hand dip every single bottle of Maker's Mark that comes through our distillery, or comes from our distillery. You can see the name Maker's Mark there, obviously. That goes to her collecting pewter pieces and sterling silver precious pieces from England, where the craftsman would put a little symbol of his mark on his finer pieces to show his pride in his work. And that was known as the Maker's Mark, or the Mark of the Maker. And so Marge thought it'd be appropriate to name this bourbon, which is the only singular product they make at Maker's Mark, and is the base for the only extensions from Maker's Mark that we can talk about in a second. So she said, let's go ahead and put our Maker's Mark on this bottle by calling it Maker's Mark. We also have a seal and a symbol, which is the SIV with the Star Hill Farm, where the family lived in Bardstown, Kentucky before moving to the distillery. And then the calligraphy and the handwriting portion of this, you can see this is a very unique font. This was Marge's handwriting as well. So this bottle is really an homage to Marge Samuels and the Samuels family. And the whiskey inside, of course, is at 100% Samuels. So let's go ahead and grab our bottle, sample of Maker's Mark. This wonderful wheated bourbon. The mash bill is going to be 70% corn, 16% soft red or winter wheat, and 14% malted barley. This will be aged to taste, but drop by drop on average, we're going to talk about a 6 to 7 year old product here. Now, 90 proof, we can expect to see a little darker color in the glass, and we will. You can swirl whiskey around if you want to. You can swirl your bourbon around if you want to. If you want to see the legs like in wine, then you'll see that these bourbons definitely do have legs, but you better believe that because it's from Kentucky, those are known as thoroughbred legs, right? So after we go ahead and take the eye of that whiskey, you always want to see that clarity, see some dazzle and brilliance. We're going to go ahead and nose this whiskey. And what you're getting as far as a grain note is you're going to get some of that soft red winter wheat speaking out. Maybe a little bit of wheat bread comes through in the aroma, but you're definitely getting those vanillins and caramels that come from interaction with the oak as well. And Maker's Mark does a unique thing that is, they're the only distillery that still honors the practice of rotating barrels. So they'll move their barrels around the warehouses there. And what that means is we'll try to make, when a batch of barrels goes up into a warehouse, they'll go to the top third of the warehouse and they'll spend the first 3 years up there. Then as they've aged in the warmer area of the warehouse and we need to start cooling them off and letting them mature and settle, we'll move them down to the bottom third or 2/3 of the warehouse, depending on what they need to do. And so hand rotating those barrels, I mentioned they're 53 gallons when they're full. They weigh about 500 pounds when they're full. Hand rotating those barrels is no small task. And Maker's Mark is the only major distillery that still honors that old practice of hand rotating barrels, which is an amazing thing to do, considering the amount of inventory they have, or that we have there. And so let's go ahead and give a taste of this bourbon. You're going to see that there's no spiciness to this bourbon, and that's because there's no rye. And so where your tingle seems to happen, or the finish is being appreciated, you'll get a lot of tingle in the front of your tongue where your sweet taste buds are. But then as that finish starts to settle in your chest and in the back of your throat, you start to kind of appreciate that sweetness that's coming from the barrel's influence, but also the fact that the wheat in our mash bill here is going to be a little bit more sweeter and softer, soft red winter wheat. And so Maker's Mark is a fantastic wheated bourbon, made with pride, as all these bourbons are, made by the family there in Loretto, Kentucky. It's an amazing distillery. I recommend if you get a chance to go on the bourbon trail, definitely make a point to come see us at Bean, because we offer perspective from a small scale to a big scale. And then to just see what a boutique, beautiful distillery Maker's Mark is, you'll never forget your experience at either distillery, and you'll never forget your experience in Kentucky. But I highly recommend coming to see us. In normal times, we open our doors most days of the year and welcome everybody with open arms. But right now, we have to be safe as everybody does. So we're not letting folks in, but when we can, you'll definitely know. Any questions about Maker's Mark? Happy to answer any now.
Sure. Adam, just one thing really quick. I will verify that Maker's Mark is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. I mean, it's stunning. It has so much history. It's amazing. So I know you can reach out to any of us and Carolyn who's here about the trail, but it is a very special place. I mean, it's great.
Yeah,
and then Erin is gonna pop on for a second in the essence of time, Adam, because we have about an hour allotted for this, but she's going to talk about some of the in-store we have, and then we can go through the next two.
Sure, you got it.
All right, sure, thank you. Thanks, Amanda. I'm Erin, and I'm just here to let you know a couple things that are going on in store during September Bourbon Heritage Month. There's several digital offers available online now through October 10th. $5 off one bottle on Maker's Mark or Basil Hayden, and Jim Beam White, the 175, which is the larger bottle, is actually on sale this week only through the 16th at $27.99. When you do go into the store, you'll also see kind of like take your first step on the bourbon trail, kind of giving you an introduction. There's some point of sale on the end caps that have different recipes, and you can grab the bottle. We always have the mail-in rebates for Maker's Mark and Jim Beam on most of the bottles as well. And then I invite you to go into the Maker's Mark website. You can sign up for your own custom label with the holidays coming up and create that, and that will get mailed to you as well. And then you can also go on to text for a chance to win a Yeti Tundra cooler with all of our wonderful bourbons on there. And then we have another Maker's Mark program as well, another text to win summer backyard event. So lots of stuff happening in store. All of that activity is at the shelf or on the end cap, or we have knuckers on the bottles. So just make sure that you get out to your local Mariano's and see all of the wonderful specials they have for September Bourbon Heritage Month. And I will let Adam quickly discuss our small batch bourbons for Knob Creek and Basil Hayden. Thanks, Adam.
All right, thank you, Erin. In honor of time, we'll speed up a little bit here. So Basil Hayden, we talked about a traditional bourbon mash bill. We've then talked about a wheated bourbon mash bill. Basil Hayden is part of our small batch collection. I alluded to Booker Noe, our sixth generation distiller, a while back, who did create small batch bourbon starting in 1988 and then released the four, as they're known, Booker's, Baker's, Knob Creek, and Basil Hayden in 1992. Kicking off that wonderful resurgence of the bourbon renaissance as we're starting to enjoy it now and have been for the last 15 years or so. So Basil Hayden, Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey again, is going to be that high rye bourbon, meaning that we use twice the amount of rye in our mash bill than we do any of our other bourbons in the small batch portfolio or from our traditional bourbons. What that high rye is going to do is it's going to offer that spice. We spoke to that rye spice, and if we highlight it, we're going to really give you the spice that you're looking for when you're looking for a rye. And over time, as Basil Hayden's become popular, people are really gravitated toward its rye because it gives it a nice, it's a very complex whiskey. It's got a light body to it at 80 proof, but it also has a really elegant spice to it and a really wonderful medium clean finish. And so Basil Hayden is actually named after a man who moved to Kentucky around the same time that Jacob Beam did. And he also distilled whiskey and farmed. He also helped settle the first Catholic church there. And that gentleman's name was Basil Hayden, as I mentioned. And just like Jacob Beam had his third generation create a little bit more of a commodity around his bourbon and his business, so did Basil Hayden. And his grandson Raymond Hayden created Old Granddad Bourbon based on what his granddad made. And Basil Hayden and Old Granddad have a nice little relationship, as some of y'all might know. We can talk about it anytime I come back to Chicago. But we have that high rye mash bill, which is going to give us that wonderful, what we have here is that golden raisin and dark straw color at 80 proof. And then when we nose the whiskey here, we know we got a bourbon, but we have a lot of grassy, floral, herbaceous, spicy notes that are coming through here. And if you kind of dig a little bit deeper in the aroma, now you're going to get that vanilla and caramel because it is truly a bourbon, backing it up and giving it that body and the aroma. And so let's see what kind of experience we have drinking a high rye mash bill. It's the only time I use the word elegant to describe a bourbon that we make. I think Basil Hayden is a wonderfully elegant, accessible, welcoming bourbon. It's a great way for anyone. If you guys are sharing with friends at home, or buying a drink for a buddy at a bar, and they want to get into bourbon, you don't want to start them at the top of the mountain with Booker's or Knob Creek barrel strength or anything like that. You want to start them with something like Basil Hayden to welcome them into bourbon and to get them kind of going. A lot of folks consider this to be the gateway into bourbon. And I think that one of the great things about Beam Suntory is with our two distilleries, with these two bourbons right here, we have the best two welcome letters or welcome wagons to the bourbon category that you could ever hope for. And Basil Hayden is a great way to refine as well, because it has that wonderful complexity and that elegant spice. Once you've played around with higher proof whiskeys or bigger whiskeys, you can always come back to the Basil Hayden. It's also a great way to start your happy hour. Goes well with cheese, goes well with wine, or not wine, but goes well with charcuterie, anything like that. So for home entertaining, 80 proof, you bring some friends over, which, we're probably bringing more friends over than going out anywhere these days. So 80 proof Basil Hayden is a great way to make sure everybody's having a good time, but staying safe at the same time and getting home, enjoying themselves. So real quick, I know we got about a minute or two left. I'm sorry about that, but we've got a little Knob Creek here. Knob Creek's one of my personal favorites. And on most mornings, you could probably lick my arm and you might be able to taste a little Knob Creek. And Knob Creek is really that flagship for big, bold flavor. One of the great things about Knob Creek is we have been 9 years historically, and we were just able to put our 9-year back on our label. So what we talked about earlier with batching, the youngest barrel in a batch of Knob Creek is going to be 9 years. So this whiskey has rested for the better part of a decade waiting for us to enjoy it, which is an amazing thing to think about when you think about how this year has been so insane. We've lived a decade in this year, but then to think about the 10 years that you've been living your life and the 10 years that this whiskey's been resting for you, all the milestones that have gone through what you've been doing and how you've been living yourself and creating yourself as the person you are. And then this whiskey just rests for that better part of 10 years, 9 years straight. So big, bold flavor from all that interaction with the barrel. And then let's go ahead and see it, 100 proof at 9 years old. We have a really nice amber color starting to develop, a nice deep caramel. And then when you nose the whiskey, it's quintessential bourbon, right? Vanilla, caramel, spice. Oh, let's give it a little taste. Fantastic bourbon. And what I mean by quintessential is you have those elements, you have that sweetness coming from the vanillas and caramels, you have a little bit of that spiciness, you have a little bit of that oakiness, but then you have that fifth element, that quintessence. And that's that feeling you get in your chest when you drink a good bold bourbon. A lot of people might call that burn, some people call that pain, but we actually call that a Kentucky hug. So the Kentucky hug is that quintessence to a good bourbon, and Knob Creek, in my opinion, is a quintessential bourbon. So it's been, I love all these bourbons. I've spent a lot of time with all of them. I'm happy to share them. I hope if y'all have any questions, and maybe we can squeeze out another minute or two to answer any of the bigger questions.
Yeah, we do have a few more, so that's great.
Right.
Well, Aaron wanted me to let everyone know, which is a great offering. Basil Hayden Dark Rye is also delicious, and we do sell that also at Mariano's. So how is that different than the Basil Hayden that we tried today?
So that's going to be a rye instead of a bourbon. What we do with Basil Hayden Dark Rye, we decided we wanted to have fun with the rye aspect that people are gravitating towards on Basil Hayden. The dark rye is going to be a blend of a Kentucky rye base, which is going to give you some spicy notes, and then a Canadian rye base from our sister distillery up north. That's going to give you some fruity notes. And then we're going to add a little bit of California port wine to the whiskey itself. So not a barrel finish, it's actually a liquid addition. It's a blend of 3 different liquids. And it really has a nice fruity spice note on its own, but then you throw that port on top of it to give you that sweet, resiny, raisiny note, and it's really tasty. We have a lot of different line extensions coming from all of these bottles. I love Jim Beam Black, Jim Beam Double Oak, and Rye is fantastic. We have a lot of fun with some Basil Hayden stuff, the Dark Rye, the Caribbean Reserve. We've got a 10-year-old rye that's out right now and a 10-year-old bourbon that's going to come out later this year. Knob Creek, we have a fantastic rye. We have a fantastic quarter oak. We've got a fantastic single barrel at 120 proof that you can find. The Maker's Mark, we do some line extensions that are our innovations there are going to be our Maker's 46, which is Maker's Mark that's been finished with the addition of seared French oak staves inside the bourbon barrel to kind of give a little more vanilla forward flavor. Really fantastic whiskey to drink there. All of them, we like to have fun. We like to celebrate the flagships of all these different brands, but we also like to talk about the extensions and the way that we also have fun creating new flavors to fit everybody's palate. You know, if you can't find a bourbon that you like at Beam Suntory, you don't like drinking bourbon.
This was a great way to taste them all together because, I mean, it's not often, I mean, I know not everyone's tasting them together. I probably can't taste anymore after this is over, but it is really interesting to try them side by side, and you really can tell the difference in flavor, complexity. Like, sure. Maker's Mark to me tasted like a banana split. It had all of like the flavors, like banana, like caramel, like a little berry. Like, it was so delicious. And then you're right, like the Basil Hayden had that very refined flavor, and I definitely got a lot more like smoke and like complexity also with the Knob Creek. So it's really cool to kind of go down this line of the 4 bourbons.
Great. Yeah, I promised y'all in the beginning that we would taste some different mash bills and taste some different flavor profiles. So I'm glad that you appreciated the tour.
It's really cool. So someone asked about, or Christy asked, does Basil Hayden come in a higher proof or a cask strength? They're all 80 proof. Basil Hayden has a 10-year Caribbean rye, Wild Sam. Did I say it right? Wild Sam?
Wild Sam. So Wild Sam's a fun partnership that we did with a group out of Austin, Texas that actually makes kind of insider city guides for cities all around the country. Okay. And look them up online, Wild Sam, WILDSAM. They make some really cool stuff, and we did a Basil Hayden Wild Sam package with them that kind of it was a really cool looking bib. And then if you turn it, you could fold it out and it would have a little bit of a bourbon guide to it. So that was fun. The whiskey is the same as our Basil Hayden bourbon for that particular release. Okay. But we have, over the last several years here, come out with, I would say 6 different Basil Hayden expressions. So a lot of fun there. You mentioned the Caribbean Rye or the Caribbean Reserve. I really like that. It's got a real great maple syrup note to it, and put on your pancakes if you want. And if you don't start drinking first thing, how can you drink all day, right? So
yeah, that's what Sunday is for. Yeah. A few other questions. So the McKeans heard that the wax drip on Makers, that if it's longer, it's different. Or is it just the way it drips? Well,
one of the stories used to be that you can tell, and this is something I believe, you can tell if you have a left-handed or a right-handed dipper depending on where the longer tendril is. Because you dip the whiskey holding it like this if you're right-handed, or you hold it like this before you put it down. And depending on if the longer tendril is on the front and the back, that'll tell you if they're right or left-handed. I want to say that right-handed is on the front and left-handed is on the back. And then any dipper worth their salt will get at least 5 drips coming down. We call those tendrils.
I only got 1, so I failed. I can't work there.
Well, luckily you're not looking for a job on the bottom.
Maybe. I don't know. It sounds like a lot of fun. And then there's a little bit of a controversial question. Was there an issue with Maker's Mark proof a couple of years ago?
Yes. So, you know, when you have an aged product, it's very hard to predict how popular you could be and what that popularity might do to your inventory. And so that day came to Maker's Mark, and the Samuels family and the powers that be decided that they could either hike up the price, which wasn't what we do. We could, limit availability, which is another thing we don't want to do. But then the last thing we could do is stretch out our availability and add and deproof it a little bit down to 86, which we did. That was the people at the distillery, our tasting team, our lab folks in the QC lab. They all agreed that at that proof we would be able to get more whiskey for the demand, but it wouldn't change the flavor. It was not what anybody wanted to do. It was something that we unfortunately had to do. I remember getting a call from Bill Samuels the day that the news was going to go out, and he told us all that it was going to happen. That week that we made that whiskey and distributed that whiskey was one of the worst weeks of my life because of all the rabbit holes that I went down on social media and the calls that I was getting and the texts that I was getting. I got some stories that I could tell you all another time. But, you know, I remember calling Bill on like Thursday of that week and saying, you know, I left a message for him. I said, I know that you're getting it 50 times worse than I am, or 1,000 times worse than I am. And I'm really sorry that you had to make this choice. We did that for a week. I got the call on Sunday that we were going to deproof. I got the call the next Sunday that we were going back to normal. And I think it's a great example of listening to your fans and listening to the people that support you. And I mean, we were getting the business from Jay Leno to NPR to Howard Stern. I remember driving by a church in Bardstown, Kentucky. It's as you drive into town on the highway, and the marquee outside on the church said, you can't water down God's word. I mean, we were getting it from all sides. And it wasn't a decision we wanted to make. It wasn't a decision we made easily. And it was a decision that we fixed very easily. And we wanted to make the decision to go back. So we made about a week's worth of that whiskey. And in my opinion, I'm very happy that the 86 proof is the collector's item and not the 90 proof.
Well, it looked like Amanda actually may have dropped off on accident, but I don't think we have any other questions. I think the last thing we wanted to end with is just a ring on the bell from Maginata, just to kind of end the class, if that's okay with you, Adam.
Absolutely. I would be honored. I would be honored to have a ring on the bell.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're
Yes,
there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm here. I'd just like to say a couple things real quick. One, Adam is one of my mentors in this company. He's an excellent ambassador and an extreme amount of knowledge coming from him. What a great class. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks everybody
absolutely.
for tuning in too.
Thank you. And also, you know, this is just a great example of what Beam Suntory and Mariano's coming together. This is what we're going to bring you every single month, every single Thirsty Thursday that we have. It's always going to be good. It's always going to be new and dynamic and informative with the best people. And so I don't know if you've, Adam, if you've seen a couple of the other videos, but I always end with a bell when everything's sealed up. And I think this is, you know, I think this is an awesome class. And I learned actually a couple things that I didn't know today. So without further ado, thank you very much. Thank you for everybody that tuned into this call. And let's seal the deal.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you, Adam. It was great. You did an awesome job, and it was fun to taste everything. So everyone enjoy Bourbon Heritage Month, and we'll see you at the next Thirsty Thursday.
Yes, please. Y'all take care.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
All right,
Bye,
cheers,
Tiffany.
guys.
Bye, McKeans. Bye, Carolyn.